process this. It moves beyond mere patience to the gracious choice to stay present with weakness, opposition, or immaturity, whether in others or in circumstances, without surrendering truth or love. So we'll talk about the applications of this idea. So when you think of tolerance, of being tolerant as a person, under what circumstances, or can you give me an example or perhaps elaborate on the idea of when you might be called upon to be tolerant? Okay, okay. So I was going to start with the easy one first, but we'll get in this one. You know, we sometimes need to exercise tolerance with regard to what I'm going to call the idiosyncrasies of others, right? I don't really like to eat lunch with that person because they eat with their mouth open, you know, all the whole time they chew with their mouth open, and it annoys the stew out of them, you know, no pun intended. So, you know, we think about idiosyncrasies and they can really gnaw at you, right? So when we need to be careful about that because we all have them. Idiosyncrasies. We may think of ourselves as being idiosyncrasy free, but that's just not the case. Yeah. So in that regard. So on the point that you were making, Barry, I'll let you elaborate on this. Well, how does tolerance have applicability to sin? And in what way? No relevance at all.
Well, it should always be able. You should always hope to teach someone that's dealing that you have when sin is obvious. Um, but there's also, let's say it's not someone that you know well, and you witness something,
Mhm.
and it's in a crowd of people. That's not necessarily the time to start quoting Bible verses to them.
Yeah.
But in the right situation, um, if you really care for someone and you know that they have sin in their life, then that's different. You have to call that out and let them know. Otherwise, you're not showing love.
Okay.
I think sometimes people mistake tolerance for silence, or they get those two confused. And silence
Right.
can absolutely support sin, and whereas tolerance doesn't necessarily mean you're going to sit there and say nothing, but it means you're going to think through what you're going to say with love and wisdom and understanding.
Okay, good points. Anything else before we get into some of the scriptures? Okay. Well, why don't we look, because if this is the only place where I list this particular passage, let's look at Romans chapter 2. In fact, we'll look at the first 4 verses of this. And I think it bears some useful points in regard to what we're talking about here. So, in this context, Paul writes this. It says, therefore you have no excuse. Therefore is based on, he's talking about a range of sins, sinful behaviors in the conclusion of the first chapter. But he says, therefore you have no excuse, every one of you who passes judgment. For in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment on those who practice such things and do the same yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and tolerance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance? What point or points is Paul making to these Christians? I guess, and I'll be more specific, with respect to tolerance.
None of us are blameless, so we have no right to judge another.
Yeah, that's well said, Antonio. So when you said, judge, in what sense is Paul using this word to judge another, or the judgment of God?
We talked about last week, the example that's given where there's someone that's called to his debts and he was forgiven those debts, and then he went to someone else who owed him and he did not forgive that person. And I think that that's a prime example of what's being listed here. So, and I know when I was a fairly new Christian, I came from a very worldly background, and I know a lot of the clothing that I wore was probably not appropriate. And it was with love and tolerance that the women around me helped me to understand, instead of coming up and saying, you're sinning, you need to do something different. And it was that tolerance and that love that they showed me that allowed me to understand the right way, why, not just that I needed to, but why I needed to dress a different way. It was my attitude. So I think that's the kind of, despite my hasty word earlier, we do have to, it's so much of it, it's ignorance. It's just a lack of understanding. And our tolerance allows someone who truly wants to know how to live the right way, that allows them to learn, and us in the same way.
Yeah. So in your particular case, some of the women, for example, that knew you and at that time, you said were exercising some forbearance with you, given your circumstances, and they didn't come and unleash on you.
Nope.
Yeah.
And it probably would have scared me away if they did.
So I think that's a good example of tolerance and kind of the attitude you bring to another person, understanding where they are in regards to that. Other thoughts about this?
The definition, the holding back aspect of this, right? That's what we're talking about. Both guns, so to speak, where you can hold back and approach things in a way that produces a good outcome. And God has held back with us in some ways to give us the opportunity to repent. So we need to, as was mentioned, reflect that approach in our own life.
Yeah, right. So this is, it is an important point when we're talking about, because there's the way in which the world kind of, well, you should be tolerant, just live and let live, would be the phrase that would describe that point of view. In regards to tolerance, this is not an overlooking. Tolerance is not an overlooking or giving somebody a free pass, would be another expression that we would view on this. But it speaks to the attitude that we bring to this circumstance, right? And on David's point of to what degree do you express yourself, or do you hold back? And so tolerance here is not an overlooking of sin, but it has to do with how we respond. And the idea of this judgment here, what I take from this is judgment, and Jesus uses this idea of, judge not, be not judged, this idea of condemning, of consigning, to the lost and the hell, right? It's judgment that's focused on the punishment, not on the redemption. it's giving up on somebody. It's writing them off. That's not what we're called to do.
Well, the Jew and the Gentiles were bad about doing this to judge one another. And even
right.
some of the Gentiles would follow some of the law of Moses. The Jews would still criticize them. So it was kind of a thing back and forth. So like you're saying, that if you know that person is doing wrong, or not following what God said, that we have tolerance enough either not to say or not to condemn them.
Yeah.
And I think there's a big difference here, because if I know somebody's openly committing sin, then I need to approach them in a Christian way to tell them, you know, hey, you need to straighten up or something, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give an example of the time and the place matters as well. There's in the heat of the moment, maybe that's not the point, the time to but if you can say, hey, we need to have a conversation about this. When can we talk about this further? And social media is a great example of that as well. I've yet to see someone converted through Facebook posts or to change their mind on something that they clearly hold as important. So if someone's saying something and you actually know that person, care about them, maybe you should reach out with a phone call and say, hey, can we talk about this, as opposed to angrily replying on that.
We kind of have two dividing things that we see going on a lot in the world right now. And unfortunately, through social media and everything's in our face all the time. We have the one where people are desperately seeking always through time to fit in with some kind of group, some kind of personality, some kind of people. And then the other side is where we are surrounded by people that don't look like us, sound like us, act like us, and all of this. So the tolerance is being able to approach someone that does not seem anything like us and treat them with the love and respect, so that they would hopefully be willing to listen to us when we want to teach them. Because the irony is, all those people that are seeking to fit in somewhere are seeking that relationship with God, and they don't even realize it.
Yeah, we are always called to exercise judgment in these matters. I mentioned, the way that somebody constantly chews with their mouth open, but there are other things that get close to this, like political points of view or opinions. I mean, you probably encountered some people that, even religious people, maybe even, other Christians that that when they're most vocal and passionate is when they're talking about politics. And, should that be their most passionate point of view? These matters, rather than things that have to do with the eternal. So this idea of tolerance is an important one, and maybe we'll look at some of these other scriptures. So this idea, I just want to stress this verse 4, because this really makes the point, this rhetorical question that Paul makes here. Or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and tolerance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance? So he's picturing these Christians, I would say probably these Jewish Christians in particular, who just like looking down their nose and their finger at these others, and not recognizing that they're the beneficiaries just as much as these Gentiles or these other sinners that they're condemning. They're just as much the beneficiaries of the kindness and the patience and the tolerance of God. So it's a haughtiness, a condemning haughtiness that they're expressing, that Paul is condemning here. But let's look at some of these other points, because I think on my pattern, it is a key element of the spiritual posture, I said, that God has chosen for us. And let's look at a couple of these other passages. In Colossians chapter 3, this point is made, I think, quite well. In Colossians chapter 3, also Paul saying in verses 12 and 13, when he couples these attitudes together, he said, so, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another. That's in the New American Standard, that's this word. Okay. Be tolerant or forbearing. Bearing with one another and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. We'll be looking at this passage in the next trait as well. So you see these attitudes coupled together of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and this idea of forbearance and tolerance. So we've been talking about this. So it is an important attitude that we are to have and that God expects us to have. The other passage, and then I'll pause and let you guys comment. But in Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, I see this point here in Matthew chapter 5 in verses 21 and through 22, even though I don't believe the word tolerance is used, but this point that Jesus is making here in regards to our personal relationships, he says, so you have heard the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Why do you think I see tolerance there? This idea, even though the word is not used. What point is Jesus making? Does the wrong or the sin begin with the act of murder, or does it come before that? Is there a trail? Yeah, you do. Yeah. Probably without much exception, probably every act of murder is a hate crime. But what? Yeah.
Again, it's the holding back concept, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, the word is not mentioned here. Principles there. People irritate us or provoke us or do things that displease us, and we're expected to hold back and not vent on them.
Yeah.
And express these kinds of things.
Yeah. That, this idea, the word, I don't, some translations might just insert this word in here, the good for nothing. It's just, he's worthless. This guy's worthless. He's not good for anything. Okay, that's one level. But the next one is that you fool, and it's more than just a stupid person. Okay, this idea really gets more to kind of morally bankrupt. That this is the idea based on some other things. I think it's a progression. So more than that, you're saying this person is spiritually, bankrupt. I mean, they're kind of beyond reach or hope or help or anything. It's the same idea of condemning somebody to, you're not worth my effort in these regards. And this level of judgment, Jesus says is quite a serious matter. He says this person is subject to fiery hell who has this attitude with regard to their brothers.
So you're saying that a person that God created is not worth anything.
Yeah.
You're saying that his creation is worth nothing.
Yeah, and yes, that's a very good point. That's basically what you're saying. And I know people, I can be very irritable, ask Anita, and people can irritate us, and we just need to exercise some caution with regard to that and make sure we check it. And the irritation might be well deserved. Other thoughts that people have about this, these two passages, that God expects us to cultivate this posture.
You did not call anybody.
Yeah.
It was a really bad thing if someone was called.
Yeah, and the idea here, it's more than just a silly person. This is somebody who's morally, and the way it's being used in this context, my understanding is somebody who's kind of morally without merit.
Or stupid. Now, I've never tolerated the word somebody call another stupid, because that's demeaning and it's hard.
Yeah.
And especially the young kids, that's
Ask a kindergarten kid, that was a bad word.
Yeah.
The S word.
Right.
I got punished if I said it. So.
I have a note that says empty head. Is another translation.
The next point here, we need to understand that it is an important expression of our love for others. This idea of tolerance. And in Ephesians chapter 4, again, Paul is making this point in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness and patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. So showing tolerance for one another in love. And it is an expression of our love for other people to have this attitude. We're all people, even though we all have different ways of showing our weakness and our humanity.
Another irony of tolerance is how we can show so much tolerance to strangers, but sometimes the ones that we're least tolerant with are the ones that are closest to us. And of
Yes.
course, it's because they can hurt us the most, but it is interesting how we're typically harder on those that we are closest to.
Yeah, that's true. And anybody who's been married for any significant period of time will recognize this idea that, and it can creep up on you to become intolerant of people that you're really close with. And it's just something to be very cautious of. If you find yourself being more tolerant and patient and respectful of strangers than you are your spouse, there's a serious problem, right? Or your brothers or sister or other family members or whatever else. And we have other expressions that convey this idea, like familiarity breeds contempt. And Jesus himself, right, that no prophet is not without honor except where?
In his own
In
country.
his own country, right? The people who know that person best. So this is a trap that we can fall into as humans. It's an important ingredient of peace, or having peace with other people, to be able to forbear or to hold back. You don't have to express every thought and idea that comes into your head, and you shouldn't, right? Because you won't have peace with anybody if you do that. And this is obviously in regards to the idiosyncrasies, but in other matters too. And I think we just read that passage in Ephesians chapter 4, and I think Paul is making this point. If we don't have sufficient tolerance for one another, you can't really have a church. Yeah, you will destroy the unity. Tolerance, as we're describing it here, is essential to having the unity that God calls us to have within the body of Christ. We are all different, have different points of view, and this does not require it be inconsistent with anything else that is taught in the scriptures, really, that we somehow have to give a pass to sin, to have this attitude. That's not what's being proposed here. It's the attitude that we bring to that. Because of course, are we going to have to deal with sin in the church? Of course we are going to have to deal with that. So it's a critical ingredient to peace, and then our relationships to one another. Maybe I just look at this passage from Romans chapter 12, which we have all heard and perhaps quoted ourselves. If possible, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. This idea. And being at peace with others is going to require us exercising this attitude. It may not be reciprocated. That's the point that he's making here. As much as it depends on you, you have this attitude. It may not be reciprocated by others, but that's life.
To the point that you keep making, which is a very important point, it doesn't mean acceptance or approval of sin. We have an example of that in 1 Corinthians 5. It's the abuse of this concept in the church of Corinth, where the man was involved in a sexually immoral relationship, and Paul said, you're puffed up about it. Right? You haven't dealt with it. And so there's the abuse of the tolerance. Look how tolerant we are, we can have this going on, and we can accept this, and that's the use of this concept when it comes to sinful behavior, as opposed to matters of opinion and idiosyncrasies and quirks and all of those things that we have to learn to navigate in spite of those things, because they're not sinful in and of themselves.
Right. Yeah, but I think and when Paul addresses this point to the Corinthians, he does give them with a particular attitude, right, to admonish him. Yeah, and to admonish him as a brother, as opposed to an enemy. This is discussed by him in his responses. I was trying to find that passage. Is it in 1 Corinthians or is it when he deals with it in 2 Corinthians?
In 1 Corinthians 5 is
Yeah.
where he talks about doing it to save the man, and
Yeah.
and do it also he's a brother. And then in 2 Corinthians 2, where he talks about reaffirming his
Yeah,
love,
right.
love once he's repented.
Right. But yeah, it's not the point now, not to treat him as an enemy,
It's interesting. Corinthians are addressed to the church of God, despite of all their difficulties and problems. Paul saw no point that they were going to Paul. They written to Paul. They asked him, "What's the solution to the problem?" So they had the right attitude.
Right. So maybe we can conclude our focus on this by looking at in Matthew chapter 7. And what I said, part of us cultivating this attitude of tolerance, I said we need to recognize that what goes around comes around in regards to this. And that's my attempt at being cute and referring to the teaching of Jesus at the beginning of Matthew chapter 7, where he says, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure will be measured to you." So in respect to tolerance, you're going to get what you give.
And when you have a brother or family member or someone who has agreed to the same standard, that's when something like Galatians 2 happens. Now, when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed. Because that was the situation where Peter knew better. And Paul could go to him and said, "You're not doing this right. And here's what's going on." And there's no reason to tolerate that because Peter knew the right thing. Paul knew the right thing. And you've been carried away with this. So has Barnabas. And so that's where when someone knows what the standard is, that's where it's much easier to say, we're not going to tolerate this.
Yeah. Right. We have higher expectations. Therefore, we view that as, maybe a reason for being less tolerant because you knew better. But there are limits to that. I mean, we all, in a sense, know better, but we're still subject to temptation and to sin. Right. And the next point, that you need the tolerance of others despite what you may think. And that's the second part of this teaching in Matthew 7 of Jesus is, why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? And this is the point he's making here. This intolerant, judgmental attitude that he's taking issue with here is an expression of hypocrisy, because you have weaknesses also, right? In fact, your weaknesses may be bigger than the weaknesses that you're particularly sensitive to in your brother. So this needs to factor into how you deal with your brothers and sisters and how you relate to them. It is not excusing or overlooking. It's the attitude that we bring to dealing with these matters with one another where sin is involved. But we do need to be particularly cautious, I think, about the tolerance we need to cultivate for others when there is no sin whatsoever. I mean, we would call them, they don't even rise to the matters that they rise to in Romans 14. These are just everyday kinds of things that we can be intolerant about. Okay. Anything further about this?
That's the bottom
Yes.
And so we gotta bear with them.
Yes, we do. I wrote this down. I'll bring it up now. I could have brought it up earlier, but we've had this expression. There may be problems with this expression about hating the sin but loving the sinner. But it does communicate, I think, a good idea. We do need to distinguish the action from the person. We can very strongly dislike the action, but we need to make sure that that dislike or that hatred doesn't bleed over to how we view that soul.
That was something that always used to stick with me that my mom said growing up. I would get in so much trouble if I called someone stupid, but I could acknowledge that something someone did was stupid. And it took me a while to understand, but it is a huge difference because there are some things that I do that are just stupid, but I don't think in general I am a stupid person.
Yeah. Momentary suspension of thoughtfulness. Yeah. Okay. So in our remaining 12 minutes, we'll talk about forgiveness. And this is the action that tolerance certainly influences. They're different than each other. And I've given some definitions here for different words that are translated forgive or forgave or forgiving in Scripture. To send forth, to send away, to remit in Matthew chapter 6. Or this other word, charizomai, I guess that's how you, that Paul uses a lot, this particular word. To bestow a favor unconditionally is a short definition. Another way, it really literally means to give freely, to exercise grace, to freely show favor. And the idea here is to give up the debt. To give up the debt. So somebody has committed a wrong against you, they've incurred a debt with you, and you give that up. This is the idea of forgiveness.
Todd?
Yeah.
Can you put your forgiveness?
Oh,
up on the
sorry.
board?
I'm sorry.
It helps to follow. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. The book. Okay. Sorry about that.
No.
So that's the idea. Like to give up the debt. Somebody owes you $10. You say, don't worry about it. It's forgiven. It's gone. It's off the ledger. But we're not talking about money here, probably. We're talking about other things. Somebody did something against you. And these are the same words that are applied to the forgiveness that we get from God. And He is our model in this case. Is, well, I want to ask this question. It's kind of silly because there's not one aspect that's easy about forgiveness when it comes to us expressing it. Forgiveness is hard. Like to give up the debt. Again, we can and should be looking to God as our model. So I've listed some elements of this attitude that we should give some attention to if we want to kind of build our capacity to forgive others, which I think building up a capacity or a reservoir that allows us to forgive is important in life and important in many different respects in regards to our relationships and our own peace of mind in life. Because we will be offended. And not, I mean, I don't mean offended in the trivial sense. I mean, we will be hurt by others. And so whether we have the capacity to forgive others who do this for us is important for many reasons. So the key elements here is to be able to cultivate within ourselves a sense of humility. We've, I think, used this passage several times in our study thus far, the importance of humility in many aspects of character building is important in this passage from Philippians chapter 2, particularly here in verse 3. Do nothing from selfish or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. So to be able to forgive, we need to understand that we ourselves are in need of forgiveness. Yeah, that we're not on some superior, higher plane that puts us above the need for forgiveness. Right? So we're with everybody else in this regard. So humility is important because once you put yourself on a high plane, it's really easy to go to the next step to say, well, you don't really need to forgive.
forgiving is obviously experiencing someone forgiving me for something. So even more so than God, because in a lot of ways, I can't relate to that. It's grander than I am. But when someone else that is like me has forgiven me because of something that I have done to wrong them,
Yeah.
that helps me. The second thing, and I'm glad they're not in here, but raising children, because you're going to be wronged a lot. They're going to say a lot of mean things. There's just stuff all the time. And not only do you have to forgive them, but you have to move on like it never happened, because it's part of their growth, and you understand in their growth that it's all temporary, and you want to maintain a strong relationship with them. And those are just two ways that have made it much easier to learn to forgive.
Yeah, those are very good. Those are very good points. And this next passage, trying to make the point in Colossians chapter 3, which we've already read once, read it again. So, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, being tolerant, and forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone. Just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. That's a high call, to forgive others just as the Lord forgave us. We'll talk about that in just a moment. It's a high call to do this, but you can see this ability to forgive is the result or the product of cultivating a number of other attitudes, if you will, values within our character: compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, tolerance. Forgiveness is the action, if you will, but it's the culmination of that in the context here. We also need to be grateful for the forgiveness that we've received, and Paul brings this up here in Colossians, but I have it referenced here in respect to Matthew chapter 6. What is Jesus doing in Matthew chapter 6? Starting in verse 9.
God forgiving us with our willingness to forgive others.
Yeah, he does. And he does that in the context of teaching them how to pray. And this very short, impactful prayer. Pray then in this way: Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, comma, as we also forgive our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And then he elaborates on one of the key points, which he probably, well, not probably, rightfully understood that might be the sticky point in this prayer. He says, "For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive you your transgressions." So there are lots of important points that he makes in this prayer, but he chose to emphasize this one because this is the toughie in this. But we need to be thankful always for the forgiveness that we have from God. And if we can do that, I think it will help us express forgiveness toward others. And can any of us, or maybe we would shudder at the thought of God ever saying to us, something like, "Remember when you did this to me?" Right? And we might have said those words in the past, or those words or something like that has been said to us. Remember when you did this to me? And you thought maybe you had forgiveness for that, but it comes up again. Maybe it wasn't really forgiven. We need to prepare, I said, to forgive in small and big ways. And we've also looked at this passage already once in our study here in Matthew chapter 18. Again, in Matthew 18, he's talking again about forgiveness. This comes up multiple times during Jesus' personal ministry because, again, I think it's a toughie. And the disciples were asking, well, how often do I have to forgive somebody? Like 7 times? Which I think is a pretty generous number. Really? Wouldn't we all agree? If somebody, the same person sinned against you 7 times, that's a pretty generous allotment. I don't think they were being particularly stingy. How does Jesus correct them? No, not just 7 times. 7 times 70. Basically saying, no, your reservoir of forgiveness must be bottomless. Must be infinite. What a challenge that is. But that's what God does for us. And then he gives them this parable of the king, and I think we talked about that previously.
I like that you put it that way, prepare to forgive, right? Because that's so key. Don't just wait until somebody wrongs you and see how you feel, react based on how you feel. You got to prepare your heart to forgive.
No, you do. I mean, it's gonna happen, and it does happen to you, right? So it shouldn't be surprising. I mean, it doesn't mean it's gonna not hurt or anything, but we need to be prepared to forgive.
I think one thing I struggle with in forgiveness is trying to always understand why, like, someone might have wronged me or something might have happened, trying to fully comprehend what the intention was. But that's not a requirement for forgiveness. We don't have to understand. We might get caught up in needing to know and really understanding what the purpose was behind that, but it's not necessary. And
No.
it shouldn't be a full at all.
Your willingness to forgive is not connected to the rationality of the behavior that you were subject to, because this is the meat of my inside joke. I say when confronted with things like that, people are complicated, and you're not going to uncomplicate them, right? There are limits to your ability to understand why they do the things that they do. Sometimes we can't even explain why we did something we did. So it's a good point. So we should be offering forgiveness of the highest quality, and this is back on Ephesians 4:32, where what does Paul say? We're to forgive like
God forgive us.
God forgave us. That's such a serious statement, to forgive like God forgave us, and you could preach a whole lesson on that, like God forgave us. What all that involves. We didn't earn anything. He forgave us. And we need to be careful. Well, I'll forgive you, but you need to crawl across this floor of glass, and then I'll forgive you. So we need to think about how we've been forgiven by God, and do our best, right, to model that.
I think this is where it starts to with the previous when Paul and Sister, he was tolerant of our nature, giving us enough time to repent so
Yeah.
that we can be forgiven.
Yeah.
And have to show those same exact traits to be patient with others, giving them a chance to come so that we can.
Yeah. The obligation, where does Jesus put the obligation if a brother sins against you? Well, you wait and just stew and stew and stew until this brother finally comes to themselves, and then they come to ask you. Where does he put the obligation? Puts it on you to go to them.
And that's an important part of this as well, because if our brother sins against us, then we just say, well, I forgive him. We left him in his sin, and we haven't helped him out of his sin. And so we can't just say, oh, I
Yeah.
forgive him,
Yeah,
because we haven't done our part.
that's right. And this was also modeled by God. Did we take the first action? No, he sent his son. Right? So that's moral. So last point, I'm already over time. So we need to dig a deep reservoir for forgiveness. And the reaction of the disciples when Jesus was teaching on the importance of forgiveness here, was increase our faith. And Luke, when he's talking about this idea of how do you cultivate this type of relationship and the obligation to forgive a brother, the apostle said, the Lord, increase our faith. Because 7 times 70 is a bunch. So that's a big ask, something that we have to prepare for deliberately. Something that we should pray for, the ability to forgive, and God will help us with that. Okay, thanks for your participation and for the extra 2 minutes you gave me.